Okay, hi everybody. Today I'm with Dr. Tim Clarey from ICR. He's a geologist. He has received a Master of Science in Geology from the University of Wyoming and a Master of Science in Hydrogeology from Western Michigan University. His PhD in geology was received in 1996 from Western Michigan University. From 1984 to 1992, Dr. Clarey worked as an exploration geologist at Chevron USA, developing oil drilling prospects and analyzing assets and lease purchases. He was full professor and geosciences chair at Delta College in Michigan for 17 years before leaving in 2013 to join the science staff at the Institute for Creation Research, having earlier conducted research with ICR in its FAST program. He has published many papers on various aspects of the Rocky Mountains and has authored 2 college laboratory books. Okay, Dr. Tim Clarey, I'm very happy you're with me tonight because I have many interesting questions for you. And we would say that most geologists don't believe in the Bible across the world, but you're not among these people. Somehow you believe in the Bible, you trust the Bible. So as the foundation of our model is the Bible, I would like you to tell us why do you trust the Bible in the first place?
Well, the Bible, if you have faith in God or in Jesus, you believe that it is His revealed word, so that the Bible is all true. And in fact, I tell my college students that I teach at a Christian college now that the only truth we have in the world is the Bible. And so science is not truth. Science is, kind of changes every decade, every 100 years, there's something new in science, and it's more of a man's philosophy. There's a lot of data that's real, but the way it's all tied together, unfortunately, doesn't match with the Bible. Most geologists are trained that there never was a flood like the Bible describes in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. And so that's off the table right away. And so they just eliminate that all these rocks had to come from some other process. And so they've created this own, I guess, worldview where they explain everything away, try to explain it as the world created itself over millions and billions of years. But I believe the Bible is true. The Earth is very young. It's only about 6,000 years old. And the rock data and the universe data and the things in our solar system all indicate that things are very, very young. I'm going to eliminate my email right now while I'm thinking about it because it's going to be causing troubles. So let me okay, now we're back. So here we are.
Okay, so would you say it's because of a lack of information? When you studied in university, you never heard about the flood model?
That's correct. I mean, when I went to the college, I spent 9 years sitting in classrooms and learning and studying things, with a little bit of work in between, and they never talk about it. The evolutionary community has taken over the universities. In most cases, there's only a few Christian universities that will talk about the flood. So you constantly hear explanations of, river systems that spent millions of years transporting across the continent, depositing certain layers, and there's never any question. People just accept it. They're just taught the same story. It's almost like they fed the same line, and they don't know any other way. So I talked to a lot of geologists when I worked for Chevron. I was a young Earth creationist. I just didn't say a whole lot because it's such a minority view that I would talk to some of the guys I knew fairly well after I got to know them, and I'd ask them what their views were, why they think the Earth is old, and I'd tell them some of the evidence that the Earth is young, and they'd never heard any of it. And so they kind of thought I was strange, I guess, because they were never taught any of that. So it's very difficult to break in. Most geologists that come through are old Earth. They may be Christians, but they believe the Earth is billions of years old, like that's all they're ever taught. And so unfortunately, the universities teach worldwide, they teach the same thing, whether you're in France or England or here in the United States. It's all the same story, and there's never any mention of the flood or ties to the Bible at all.
Okay, Yen, can you say a word about this majority versus minority? Because some people would say, let's believe the majority. The majority must be correct. but we are a minority, and we think that sometimes the minority has the truth.
Well, yeah, that's one thing I've learned by reading different books by different people, and one thing is you got to remember consensus is not science. So majority is not science. Just because it's the majority view doesn't mean that's the correct view. There's often, the only way science advances, so to speak, is if you have new ideas, and sometimes you have to break the old molds. But unfortunately, they broke the old mold of the Bible being true, and they went to their own story, and it's hard to break back into that. But there's one example, Alan Fiducia, who's an evolutionary paleontologist, and he doesn't believe the consensus that dinosaurs are birds and dinosaurs evolved into birds. And he's getting all sorts of pushback because he doesn't believe the majority view. He's kind of minority in that paleontology world. Even though he's an evolutionist, he doesn't subscribe to what the evolutionary majority is saying, that dinosaurs turned into birds or dinosaurs are birds. He goes, no, these are birds. They're separate from the dinosaurs. And because of that, he's getting all sorts of abuse, so to speak, in the scientific community. It's kind of what we as creationists feel all the time. We're always considered non-scientists just because we believe the Bible is true, and so we're kind of shunned. He's now getting shunned because he doesn't agree with the consensus view. So that's pervasive in science. It isn't just the creationists versus the mainstream science. It's anybody that disagrees. Same thing is true with climate change. If you disagree with climate change, then you're also shunned. You don't get funding, that sort of thing. So you have to find evidence supporting climate change, or many of the university professors wouldn't get any funding, and then let them get let go. And so it's kind of a circular reasoning in some ways. You find what you want, what you need to find, so you can keep employed. And it's unfortunately the academic world. If you deviate from the consensus too far, your funding will be cut off, whether it's in paleontology or geology or something related to climate change. You've got to kind of get in line and agree with everybody else, even though that may be wrong. We'll find out maybe 100 years from now that was completely wrong. But the Bible has never been shown to be wrong. The Bible has always been true. And there's strong evidence of the flood. Just what the research that I do at ICR has really shown that there really is a global flood.
Okay. And in geology, we have three broad models, which are uniformitarianism, neo-catastrophism, and catastrophism, or we would call it flood geology. So can you say a word about these three broad models and where we started and where we are now? Uniformitarianism, neo-catastrophism, and flood geology. So 200 years ago, we had, with Charles Lyell, uniformitarianism, and then the secular geologists, they shifted from that.
To neo-catastrophism, yeah. Okay. Well, the uniformitarian view is that everything, which is what, like you say, Charles Lyell started, goes back to James Hutton in Scotland. And he saw erosion was really slow, deposition was really slow. So he figured that these rocks being deposited as we see them today, the rates we see today, must have taken thousands of years. And he actually threw in the word millions. And so he started going right to millions. I think for a reason, because millions is some number you can't even imagine. Nobody can imagine 1 million years. And so it's almost like jumping to, play money or monopoly money, I call it, in terms of years. You're jumping way out of, where nobody can even fathom it. So then you go to billions. And so, of course, they found techniques to try to verify those. But that kind of started where strict uniformitarianism is that everything is uniform. Slow erosion, slow deposition. Everything takes long periods of time. Well, after Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980 here in our backyard, so to speak, in the United States, a lot of the geologists realized there are big catastrophes that happen. And these catastrophes do make big changes in the geological world. And so they now take uniformitarianism and they've kind of added in catastrophes. So every so often there's a big catastrophe. Everything's slow in between, and then there's a big catastrophe. So that's been kind of tied into the uniformitarianism, like neo-catastrophism, whatever you want to call it. And so those all hold to the old Earth, that the Earth is billions of years old.
Did they change their time scale?
Not really, not that I know of. That's not my definition. Now, when you get to the flood geology, then you get to the time scale change where you suddenly say, okay, the Earth is only 6,000. Some people say 10,000, but I believe 6,000 is more accurate. That everything happened under certain conditions. So things can happen really quick. During the year of the flood, major changes happened to the Earth, including the crust was changing, it was cooking and melting, and you have all this deposition of thousands and thousands of meters of sediment all over the world, which is what I've been mapping out across 6 continents now. And wrapping up underneath my computer here, I've got New Zealand. I'm trying to wrap that up. And then all I will have to do is run what I can around Antarctica. But every continent shows the same pattern of deposition at the same time. And it's burying the same fossils at those same elevations. So I'm finding really strong evidence of a global phenomenon that took place in that one year of the flood. But those were special conditions. And so under certain conditions, you can form oil really fast, you can form coal really fast, you can deposit layers really fast, like we saw at Mount St. Helens. But people still don't want to think about a global event. They still want to make it, slow and with an occasional catastrophe. But flood geologists, we believe the Bible is true. There really was this flood. If that flood took place, there should be evidence of it. And I see it everywhere I look. Everywhere I look, you just got to look down. There in France, you get the Paris Basin below you, full of thousands of meters of sediment. And the areas, those were all deposited, we believe, in the flood year. And then they were folded, some of them tilted, because they were still soft later in the flood year. And some of that even happened during the receding phase of the flood. But that flood year was a major world-changing event that people, even myself, it's hard to fathom because we can't see that type of thing happening today. We see local floods, but we don't see a global phenomenon like the global flood really did. So we kind of make the flood small in our minds because we can't imagine it. Just like we make God small, even though he's infinite, he's everywhere. It's hard as humans, it's hard for us to fathom that. But I do see the evidence that there was a major, catastrophic event with thousands of meters of sediment being deposited across most of the continents all over the world at the same time in the same approximate order. And it was a progressive flood. It didn't flood everything right away. It flooded a little bit more, a little bit more, eventually went over the top. And we see even that where it went over the top, the highest point is consistent on every continent as well for the most part.
Okay.
To me, there's no other way to explain what I see. The rocks, these are the real rocks in place based on oil wells and things drilled all over the world, offshore and onshore. To me, there's no other way to explain it. When you look at all the continents at once, they all show a global flood.
Okay. If the slow, gradual processes were true, what kind of landscape would we observe around us?
Well, we wouldn't see continuous layers like we see. So if you go to, in the United States, you have Grand Canyon. And I just got done rafting that about a week ago and went down 6 nights on the river, and you see the continuous layers, just like the bookshelves behind me. They're just perfectly flat, and there's layer. And those layers, based on the oil wells, go all the way across our country here in the United States, from one end to the other. Many of them go, and they're only maybe a few hundred, maybe 100 meters thick in many cases. So how do you get these really thin layers across, massive areas like the United States or North America? And the same thing is true in Asia and Europe and Africa. You see these layers that are flat and they're stacked on top of each other with no evidence of erosion. Grand Canyon was supposed to have been created in 6 million years, but you've got layers that are perfectly flat on top of each other in Grand Canyon, exposed over 400 kilometers. You're looking at these areas and they're all perfectly flat, and there's supposed to be millions of years of time in between the layers. So where's the canyons like Grand Canyon? There should be lots of cutout sections, but the rocks are just flat. There's no evidence of deep time or great time between the layers, even though they claim there's 160 million years here and 2 million years here. The layers are perfectly flat, and they're not just in the Grand Canyon. They go across the continent, they go across to the next continent. And so many of the same layers we see in North America, we see in Europe, we see in South America, that almost in the same order, the same pattern. And that's what I'm seeing when I look at the whole world. There's very, very common explanation that to me only points to the flood. But we would expect to see not continuous layers. You see all sorts of canyons and cutouts and erosion all over the place. You wouldn't see these massive layers that are just flat for many, many kilometers, and then the next layer flat for many, many, in case thousands of kilometers. They just go and go and go. And that's what the oil wells show us, that these layers are continuous. They don't just where we can see them, they go across massive parts of the world from continent to continent. So to me, if it was really slow uniformitarianism, you wouldn't see these flat layers that are just one layer on the next. You see all this canyons cutting out. There'd just be little pieces of rock here and there stacked on top of each other.
Okay.
Hope that makes some sense. I know.
Yeah.
I don't speak French. I wish I did. All I know is merci beaucoup and a few things like that. When I visited Paris, and it's a beautiful place. I like to go back. I went to a geology conference there.
Okay.
15 years ago, but I enjoyed the food and the people and the museums. And
okay.
I want to come back, Anthony. But anyway.
Yes, tell me next time.
Mm-hmm.
There's something interesting is that on the continent, we have lots of marine rocks.
Mm-hmm.
So this is very interesting. Do you have a percentage?
Well, we actually have, you can find marine fossils all over the world. You could find marine fossils, particularly in Europe, for example. They did a study of the Cretaceous rocks where they find dinosaurs a lot. And they find the dinosaurs are found mixed with marine animals. They're actually mixed in marine rocks. They're found in rocks that are like limestones. That's the most common way. They thought that was the exception, but they found that's the rule. It was a paper done about 7-8 years ago where they studied all the Cretaceous rocks in Europe, and they realized that these dinosaurs are being found in marine sediments, as they call them, rocks deposited by ocean water. And we see that in the United States. We see mixing of land and marine. We see dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex in Montana, where they find them in northern United States. They find 6 species of sharks right in with the dinosaurs. They find all these other clams that are marine clams. The evolutionary community tries to say, oh, those are all freshwater sharks, or those are all freshwater rays, or the coelacanth fish we find with Spinosaurus in Africa, Morocco, for example. Oh, those must have been freshwater coelacanths. But today, all these, most of the sharks live in ocean water. Most of the coelacanths, all the coelacanths we find are in the Indian Ocean. They're actually pretty deep. They're down several hundred meters down. They have to pull them up. So they're living in the deep ocean. So how could they, they look the same in the fossils. Why would they be freshwater just because they're found with dinosaurs? And then today they're living in the deep ocean, in the salt water. And so the evolutionary community says a lot of things that aren't based on any facts. They just don't want to change their story because we see it all over the world, from India to South America, everywhere I look. You see this mixing of land animals and marine animals in the fossil record. You see land plants, in with the ocean. You see things washed in and out. We even see, I think it was an ammonite marine fossil, kind of a circular, like a chambered nautilus, found in amber. And so it must have been hard to get, buried in tree resin, unless it was washed onto the land, type of thing. So there's really strange things out there. We point out a lot in a lot of our publications, our news stories at icr.org that you can look up and search if you're listening. And but a lot of these things there's a lot of it out there. It doesn't get talked about much. Usually they'll just explain it away and say, well, those are all freshwater animals at the time. But there's no evidence that they were. It's just they don't want to believe in a flood, even though there's evidence of this mixing everywhere. To me, that's what you'd expect in a flood. If you're bringing waves in from the ocean, washing across the land, you got to bring in marine animals, ocean animals, and you're going to mix them with the land animals as you bury them all in sediments. And that's what we see. And so the flood really does explain what we see better than the uniformitarian or evolutionary world does.
Okay, and the evolutionists, they have a concept you call the mega sequence, and they have 5 or 6 extinctions, massive extinctions. And can you say how we can deal with those in the flood model?
Well, I think those extinctions are really, they're not really extinctions in terms of the animals didn't necessarily disappear. Some of them did during the flood. I think God did destroy some of the environments, like where trilobites and some of these marine animals lived, and they must have had a special environments in the pre-flood world. So there are some marine animals that went extinct in the flood, but God did say he would bring 2 of every kind of land animal onto the ark. And so the land animals were preserved on the ark, but not all the marine animals. So there were some real extinctions, but nonetheless, most of those 5 extinctions, they talk about the 5 great extinctions, are really just the last appearance of certain animals at a certain layer. And I think those are really just where there's no longer fossils above that. And many fossils are found alive again today, like the coelacanth disappears at the end of the Zuni mega sequence, or right around the end of the Cretaceous in the rocks. But yet there's no fossils after that, but yet it's still swimming in the Indian Ocean. So those are called living fossils. And there's a whole bunch of living fossils that disappear in the rocks, but they're still alive today, even some plants. But the way the extinctions really are, as the flood progressed, as I'm seeing in my research, it was a progressive flood. So early on, it just flooded shallow seas. So all we see in the early rocks, the Cambrian explosion and above, or Ordovician and Silurian, those names, those all we see is marine fossils. There's almost no land animals, no land plants at all, because you're just burying things in the shallow seas. And then as the water was pushed up higher, due to, I believe, catastrophic plate tectonics and more ocean floor being created, then you flooded the coastal areas. So now you start to see all over the world at the same time, you see coal shows up, from plants being buried in the flood, and then land animals start to show up mixed with marine. But they're different than what we see later. So as you go higher, then you wipe out that environment, and that environment is gone. It's just like going up the side of a mountain. It's different ecological zones, we call it, different layers of different environments that God created. So you bury the swampy type things, and you go to the drier land areas, you go to the upland areas, and you see different environments. And as you change and bury an entire environment, it looks like those animals disappear because they're no longer found in the rocks above. And so many animals look like they go extinct at certain levels in the flood. And there's 5 of them where there's major shifts in what's being buried at the time. And those are, the evolutionary community argues that those are extinctions. But again, as I mentioned, many of those animals are still alive today. They just don't have any fossils. And so I asked Stephen Jay Gould that one time at a talk he gave afterwards. He took questions. I said, how do you explain these living fossils that we find, like the coelacanth fish, in your evolutionary model? And he goes, that's a big problem. And he said, next question. He didn't have an answer. And so it's, these extinctions to me are just the last appearance of certain animals in the flood at that level, because you're burying their complete environment. So if you completely bury a swampy environment and you move to the next environment that's a little drier, a little higher elevation, you're going to have different animals and plants living there. So it's going to look like things went extinct to move to the next layer, to the next layer. And that's what I think the flood explains these claimed extinctions better, that they're not really extinctions, just the last appearance of certain types of animals and plants at a certain level, because you're burying a new environment. And so you get new fossils. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah.
You speak really good English. Anthony.
I'm trying.
Your listeners.
We've all watched the movie Jurassic Park in the 90s. Yeah. And we all remember this sentence from a famous actor 65 million years ago. Mm-hmm. So there's a theory out there that says that the dinosaurs perished during like a Chicxulub meteorites event. Mm-hmm. But we don't believe that as creationists. What do you think about this theory?
Well, I studied that when I was looking at the oil wells drilled into the so-called Chicxulub area, and there's actually a lot of wells drilled in. And one of the problems I have with it is number one, there's no physical crater there. It's all a gravity signature. So there's never a map showing an actual physical crater. And that's what people don't realize. There's no crater there. It's just a gravity signature which reflects the densities of rocks below. So there's a difference in density of the rocks, but there's a couple of things happening there that kind of overlap. And gravity data is very ambiguous. It can be explained by deep rocks or shallow rocks or both. And it kind of adds things up. And so there's, number one, there's no crater. Number two, when they looked at the oil wells there, and I looked at them, there's almost no iridium, which is supposed to be this dust cloud that came up. This rare earth element, iridium, that they found in Italy originally at this layer, but they found it at other layers as well. but there's only 3 of the 10 wells have any iridium in it at all. So here is the supposed smoking gun, and there's no smoke. And so where's all the earth iridium? Well, it all blew away. I've heard all sorts of stories about that. And then secondly, there's not enough melted rock for a big impact that came in the size they say it was, 8 or 10 kilometers, to make this huge gravity signature to wipe out, many of the animals of the world. There's not enough molten rock, not enough rock melted from the heat. So only one well of the 10 wells shows about 300 meters of melt for igneous, or basically like igneous rock or like a lava that melted. And one other well shows about 100 meters, and basically that's it. There should be 3 to 4 kilometers of molten rock from an impact that big, and yet it's not there. So the physical evidence is not there of an impact. There's no crater, no physical crater. There's just a gravity signature. They show the maps of the gravity. It looks like a circle somewhat. And then when you look at the wells drilled into it, they don't support an impact. I think it's just an igneous intrusion, like it used to be before this all kind of was used as an excuse. And so unfortunately now it's being taught as fact that there was an impact, but the data doesn't support it. And iridium can come from volcanoes. And there's lots of volcanic activity going on all over the world at that time, near the end of the Cretaceous. And that was one of the reasons why God used that to bring on the Ice Age later. You need these explosive volcanoes like we see. So there's volcanoes in Indonesia that produce a lot of iridium. They produce shock quartz, all these things we see that they claim as evidence for an impact. They can all be produced. And I wrote a paper on that, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. It's on Answers Research Journal, published out of the Answers in Genesis group. But it's online. It's available for anybody to read. It has to do with the Chicxulub crater, but I didn't even mention at the time that there's really no physical crater. And since then, they did find iridium in one more well. So I think in my paper I say 2 wells, but they found a little bit in the 3rd well they drilled too. But 3 out of 10, you should have 9 out of 10, and there should be a lot more melt. And there's some issues as well I talk about in that paper, but I don't believe there even was an impact there. If there was, it was tiny.
Okay.
And it couldn't have caused the extinction. Sorry, that was a long explanation. But I know too much about it because I studied that specifically. But I don't believe that caused the extinction of dinosaurs because there really was no extinction of dinosaurs.
So what happened to them?
They got on the
ark. They go extinct.
Yeah, God brought 2 of every kind on the ark, and I think there's only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs, maybe 70. He would have brought 2 of every kind, 120, 140 pairs of dinosaurs total onto the ark, and then they got off the ark. And the world was changed so dramatically from the pre-flood to the post-flood. I think the world was really warm in the pre-flood world everywhere. Afterwards, you got a much colder climate because of all the volcanic activity, cooling the earth. And then you had an ice age that came on within a few hundred years after the flood. All this was happening, and it caused the dinosaurs to have to live around the equator where it was warmest. Whereas before they could roam around a little further up and not stay in that. And I think they overlapped with humans a little more as well. Before the flood, I think they lived in an area separate from humans, and then they can finally see you. Yeah. And then they were away from humans, and then after the flood, they're in sort of competition with humans. They were living in the same areas, and we see lots of paintings and carvings from the time of the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. In the Louvre there in Paris, you have a cylinder that you can roll out, and you can see these long-necked dinosaur-looking things. And to me, the amazing thing is the legs are coming straight down. They didn't know the legs of dinosaurs came straight down until 1841, when Sir Richard Owen defined what a dinosaur was. And so all these paintings, even the Welsh paintings of these lizards and dinosaurs and dragons, whatever they call them, they all show the legs coming straight down. And no reptile today, crocodiles, they sprawl, all these animals sprawl out, dragging their bellies. Dinosaurs, legs came down. They didn't drag their bellies, and all the paintings and carvings are across Europe and across India, Asia, and even some in Cambodia, all show animals with the legs coming straight down. To me, that's compelling. And how would these people know that all over the world when they never saw? Those animals don't exist today. So I think dinosaurs existed for quite a while, but eventually humans were killing these dragons. Which they call dragons, and there's carvings of them all over, particularly in Europe, where you're at. There's really, you go to England, you can see the the carvings at the one Carlisle Cathedral. But don't tell me you're a creationist. I'll never show you. They never pull the rug back and show you. But there's a little around Bishop Bell, I think, is where he's buried. There's an inlaid brass ring that goes around about this wide or so. And a colleague of mine here went over and got pictures of it. And it still shows long-necked dinosaurs with legs coming straight down. And that was, just a few hundred years ago. So I think dinosaurs were with us for more than we think. They would have been considered living fossils. And that's not a big surprise, but the evolutionary world just says, oh, those aren't real. Those are just mythical animals. But they look just like dinosaurs, how dinosaurs walked, which before anybody knew that. To me, that's compelling.
Okay, let's jump back to the flood and say something about continental drift or continental sprint. And the catastrophic plate tectonics, the Pangea, is something very interesting to study the Pangea that broke into several continents. Can you say a word? Because when we think about the flood, we think about rain.
Right.
But it's much more than rain. Much more geological changes.
Well, the flood talks about the fountains of the deep bursting in Genesis 7:11, and then it goes on to talk about other things. But other people think the flood just lasted 40 days, and so that's because it was heavy rain for 40 days. But I think there was a lot of rain that continued through the flood. But I don't believe the land was probably being flooded until after day 40, and it talks about the ark floated on day 40 after day 40. And so I think maybe early on it was just mostly, the shallow seas were being flooded. You're burying these little marine animals. Most of the people living on land weren't being flooded. And so therefore the Bible just talks about the first 40 days were mostly rain, but there's a lot more than rain because eventually the ocean was pushed up from below and that pushed the water onto the land. So the traditional plate tectonics, it took about 60 years for people to accept that. People were talking the 1910, 1920, 1930 Alfred Wegener about continental drift, but he had no mechanism to move the continents. He just saw how they fit together into like a Pangea and that they could break apart, but he didn't know how. So then we studied the oceans. People started studying the oceans after World War II because they're worried about, communist submarines sneaking around and that sort of thing. So we started really putting a lot of money in, at least in the US and I think the world, started studying the oceans. And some of the British scientists and the American scientists, Canadian scientists, we're starting to see, and some of the French guys, we're starting to find evidence that the ocean is new. The ocean was made new. Even in terms of evolutionary community, they think the ocean is very young. It only goes back to the Jurassic. And so there's no ocean crust older than maybe Triassic or Jurassic, which is like the fourth megasequence into the, if you count megasequences, the Ipsarica or Epsiroca megasequence. So the ocean somehow turned over really quickly. And John Baumgartner took that plate tectonics data and started modeling in a very, very sophisticated computer that our US government had created at one of our government research labs. He was able to do research as a creationist. They said, we don't care, you're a good guy, do what you want in your spare time. So he made this model and he showed that as these plates start to subduct into the earth, as the ocean crust goes down in, and you're looking at a 100-kilometer thick crust in lithosphere, kind of is about 100 kilometers thick. That whole thing is going down. We can still image that today. And you can see, but as it went down, he says they reach a certain temperature, it would just fall in really quickly. So you're looking at several meters per second. Whereas today it's just, the world can measure the plate movement, it's just a couple of centimeters per year. So he says, this way, way, way faster during the flood. It was moving several meters per second. And so that's not per year even. So he says it's falling in almost like a weight in water. And he showed that his math, everything that he did, all his mathematics, his complicated models, no one has shown that to be wrong. They just ignore them. They just think, oh, that can't be. And so just like people didn't believe the plates were moving 100 years ago, now they don't want to believe that there was a year of the plates moved really fast. Well, the key to that all is if you're making plates really fast, you make a lot of new hot crust, and hot crust in the ocean is thicker and kind of rides higher. It's more buoyant. So it's just to push the bottom of the ocean up. So as you made more and more crust, you push the water higher and higher because you're pushing more and more seafloor up. And the more you made, the more it pushes up. So you can push about, I think Andrew Snelling at AIG did an estimate that it's about 1.5 kilometers, maybe almost 2 kilometers you can push the water up. Yeah, about 1.5, 1.8.
So this explains the part of the flooding.
It explains a lot of the flooding. I think if the Earth didn't have big mountains, maybe just hills, maybe 5,000 foot high relief in the pre-flood world, you can easily push up the bottom of the seafloor, like the bottom of your bathtub goes up. There goes the water under the land. So as you made more crust, it went higher. And that explains what I see as a progressive flood as well. Early on, there's very little flooding because you weren't making a lot of ocean crust. But then when the ocean crust really kicks in that fourth mega sequence, you made a whole new ocean crust in the course of that year. You started pushing the water higher and higher and higher, and that's eventually it went over the top. And then as it cooled, it sank and went back to where we are. Today we have ridges that are very narrow and thin that run down the mid-Atlantic, for example. But during the flood, those would have been really broad ridges. And even the evolutionists believe that to explain the mega sequences. They think millions of years apart. Of course, they don't believe it all happened quickly. But John Baumgartner's work has been verified also by seismic tomography. So there's seismic tomography out there that shows across these subduction zones today, they can still see the density of the cold lithosphere, that 100-kilometer slab going down into the Earth. And it goes down, it looks the same density all the way down, in many cases, to the top of the core. So you've got a couple thousand kilometers of cold material way down deep in the Earth. How did that stuff stay cold if it went down slowly, a couple centimeters per year over 200 million years? It shouldn't still be cold. But we're finding these really cold slabs down deep in the Earth all the way to the core that verifies that there was rapid movement. The only way to explain those logically is to say these must have moved down there quickly, just a short time ago, and not slowly like we see today. But once you used up all the original ocean crust that was cold and dense, and all you had is new hot crust, everything kind of stopped. So that's why plate tectonics today is only moving a couple centimeters per year, is there's no density difference, not enough of a contrast between the original old ocean crust that I think that God created and the new hot crust that was created during the flood. And so everything kind of shut off. And so that's why God says I'll never flood the Earth again, because he's not going to have the plates move fast again. And so without fast plate movement, you don't push the water up onto the contents again. So to me, there's a lot of evidence to show that plate tectonics is real, but it's more than that. It's a rapid, or what we call catastrophic plate tectonics, or continental sprint, as you mentioned. And it's actually been verified by the seismic tomography they've been shooting the last 20 years, that there's these cold slabs way down deep in the Earth, which I've never heard a good explanation of other than they must have moved down there fast. But nobody wants to
have some evidence about a quick occurring of this.
Exactly. And I've got a rock. Well, I've got a rock here I want to show you as well that I collected in Alaska. This particular rock, since we're on camera, this particular rock, you can see it's really black up here in the top half, and it's less black down here. Well, this stuff at the top, this is called pseudo-tachyllite. This is from rocks that are moving so fast they melted. And so this melt was about maybe 1/3 of a meter thick. It's about so thick. And a couple of zones of that, and that's the thickest they found in the world. And this is a subduction zone that was moving during the flood year, and it shows real rapid movement so fast that it melted the rocks, which normally, even earthquakes today don't melt rocks much. Maybe just a millimeter or two. And to get that much melt, the evolutionary guys are like, well, it's just an extraordinary amount of movement must have been taking place, but they don't put a number on it. So there's even some physical evidence on the Earth that these plates are moving fast during the flood year. And then we see all that seismic tomography in the Earth, again, verifying that this rapid movement took place, pushing those cold slabs deep in the Earth. So there's construction going on outside of our building. They're pouring the road, so you hear a few honks.
I've also heard about an argument from creationists about magnetic field quick reversal recorded in rocks. So can you say a word about this?
Well, I'll try. That one's a little bit sketchier. Russ Humphreys, he's kind of come up with an idea that those cold slabs going in the Earth might have got down to the core and disrupted the magnetic field by the cold temperature of those cold slabs coming down. And he thinks that might have disrupted the magnetic field because the outer core is liquid and convex theoretically. And that, we're not really sure how the magnetic field is generated, but it seems to be somehow the outer core plus the inner core is solid, and there's some sort of movement of the material, whatever it is. It's claimed to be iron and nickel, but nobody really knows. Russ Humphreys thinks it might even be water under supercritical temperatures that can still make a magnetic field because of the polarity of water. But I don't know. We don't know what's down there really, other than we can detect the magnetic field. There appears to be rapid reversals. We see the magnetic field reflected in the magma at these ridges. As you go away from the ridges, you see parallel, times where the little magnetic minerals are pointing more to the north, and then you go a little further out, they're all pointing the other way to the south, and then they're all pointing there. So they can do this residual. They can take these basaltic rocks and they can extract out the little, almost like little compasses in the iron-rich minerals that are pointing in the direction of the magnetic field at the time they cooled, and they're kind of frozen in ice. They can't move. So as they move away, and you see a consistent pattern of north-south, north-south, north-south. Every ocean shows the same pattern. Some oceans the lines are thicker because they were spreading faster than others. Like the Pacific Ocean, everything's a little wider, but you see this consistent north-south, north-south, north-south pattern. And as creationists, we explain it as disruptions to the magnetic field taking place during the flood year, but it's settled down now, so we're not seeing that. The evolutionary community, they don't really have a good explanation for it either, other than they see evidence of several hundred reversals. It's recorded in the rocks. It's like a tape recorder. This ocean crust is like a magnetic recorder, and so for whatever reason, the magnetic field is flip-flopping back and forth rapidly. You were recording that in the rocks. As they cool, they crystallize and hold those little compasses in, and we can back that out, which is amazing technology. They can do that, but it indicates that there was some sort of rapid reversals. But it was universal because every ocean shows the same pattern, but it's hard to explain exactly from a creationist standpoint. Russ Humphreys gives us the best, possibility that there was some sort of disruption with the rapid plate movement causing the magnetic field to kind of go a little, as we say in the States, haywire, a little bit a little out of control, north and south, rapid reversals. But again, nobody really knows, and so I don't want to.
Okay.
It's hard to explain.
How do we explain the high mountains in the secular model and the biblical model? It seems that the creationist model fits more the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I believe it does. I think most of the mountains around the world, but I'd say 80% of them formed during the receding phase of the flood. They all formed at about the same time. There's a few that formed early in the flood, like the Appalachians and the mountains in Western Europe. Those seem to form midway through the flood. The Urals, for example, but almost all the other mountains, the Alps, the Andes, the Rockies, the Himalayas or Himalayas, all those formed late in the flood year, and the water was receding, we believe. And so it's because the rapid plate movement was thickening the crust. So suddenly you've doubled your crust thickness. When you double the crust, there's some principles in physics that shows that if it's thicker, it's going to go down more and it's going to go up more. So there was rapid movement of, in some cases, a couple hundred, let's see, trying to do my conversions, metric from U.S. units, but it's like, you're looking at 25,000 feet, which converts to, I can't do the meters in my head right now, but it's considerable.
25,000 feet.
Yeah, so you're looking at.
It's about almost 8 kilometers.
Okay, so you're looking at 7,000 meters of movement that took place because you thicken the crust. So many places where we had subduction going on during the flood year, like the West Coast and the Andes, and the West Coast of the United States, you had sudden rapid movement of these things to they have to equilibrate to almost the crust is really thick, so therefore it's going to rise really fast. And so we see as the water was receding, God also pushed a lot of the mountains up, which helped drain the water off as well, which I think served two purposes. But Noah and the animals were still on the ark when most of this was going on, which is we differ from some of the creationists who think the flood ended at the Cretaceous. We're seeing the evidence that the flood ended at, basically almost just before the Ice Age.
The flood boundary.
Yeah, the flood boundary is a big thing, but we think it's higher. We agree with John Baumgartner, Mike Ord. We see way too much ocean crust still forming to say the flood was over, and most of the mountains formed while the flood was receding as well, not when the flood was over. And so we think the flood boundary is way up around the Pliocene, upper Cenozoic or upper Tejas mega sequence before you really get into the Ice Age. And so
most of the geologic record was produced during the flood. From the Cambrian to the Cenozoic, higher Cenozoic?
Yeah, I believe those are all flood rocks. I think the flood was rising the first 5 mega sequences. So from the Cambrian and maybe below, some of the pre-Cambrian rocks seem to be flood rocks in many places as well, which I'm mapping. I got to go back and work on that some more. But for sure, from the Cambrian up through, I believe, the Cretaceous or the Zuni, those are all rising. The flood was progressively rising higher and higher the first 5 sequences. And then it reached a peak. And then the last mega sequence, the Tejas, is the receding phase. And that includes all most of the Cenozoic, except for the Ice Age and younger, so what they call the Tejas mega sequence. To me, that fits the data. We see limestone still being deposited across the Middle East, across North Africa, through all the Cenozoic all the way right up, and across Europe in many places. You've got Cenozoic rocks that are reflective of marine conditions still, so the water was still there, hadn't fully drained off until the end of the Cenozoic, pretty much, or close to the end of what they call the old tertiary, or now it's the Neogene. Geologists change the names all the time just to confuse everybody and themselves. and so you get it's several different names, but it's the Tejas mega sequence or the tertiary or most of the Cenozoic. But the Cenozoic also includes the Ice Age and today. So, but we think it's pretty high because there's so much ocean crust still being made. Half the ocean crust was made after the Cretaceous was over, still had plates moving around real fast. So it's hard to say the flood was over when you still had the mechanism of the flood still humming right along. Still moving the same speed. There's no indication it slowed down until about the Pliocene, which is upper Cenozoic.
Could we get the high mountains in the secular model, given the erosion rate that we observe?
I think you're onto something there. I don't think you can, because the erosion rate that they measure today, even today, is like 40 feet per million years. And so these mountains are supposed to take many millions of years to form. They'd be eroding faster than they can form. You should have no Appalachian mountains at all. The Appalachians are supposed to have formed 200 and some million years ago. They should be almost gone. I mean, they're still pretty big. They're not as big as the Rockies, but there's a lot of mountains, a lot of the ocean, a lot of the Earth's crust. The Hawaiian Islands, for example, they shouldn't even exist. They erode too quickly to be 5 million years old and 3 million years old. And so that's a very, very good point, Anthony, that these, they don't want you to think too much. When you're taught geology class, they just teach you this, look at there's 160 million years of time missing here, 500 million years here. They just say, isn't that cool? But where's the erosion between those layers? Why are there mountains? If the erosion rate is what it even is today, which is pretty slow, they still shouldn't be these mountains. You can't move these thrust sheets. There's big thrusts all over the world, massive amounts of sedimentary rock that slid, for hundreds of kilometers, square kilometers, and they're several kilometers thick sometimes. These things had to move on water. They had to be like super high pressure water zones that got trapped in between impermeable layers like in clays and salt layers. To get those to form, you can't move them slowly over millions of years because the water would dissipate. You couldn't keep that high pressure. And that's what you're taught when I went to school, is these things move slowly over millions of years, but they erode away too, even faster, just like the mountains. And so there shouldn't be any of this. If it's really millions of years old, there should be all should be wiped out. There should be erosion everywhere. Shouldn't be continuous layers going across the continents from one end to the other, stacked on top of each other like we see at Grand Canyon. All that shouldn't exist if the Earth is really millions and millions of years old, like they say, or even billions. But they don't think about that. They just say, look, here's what we got here. These are dated at this, these are dated at this, these are dated at this. And the problem is they've got the microphone. They can say whatever they want because they've won over the scientific community to the story, pushing God out. They made their own story up to explain where humans came from, and it's it's exactly what Satan wanted to do. He wants to deceive people, and so he wants to deceive the scientists to convince people that there is no God. You don't need a God to do all this stuff. The story of the Bible is cute and all, but it's not real. That's what they want you to believe, but it really is true.
There is also an interesting feature in the mountains, which are the rock bent or fold. Mm-hmm. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, the folding of rock is you try to fold rock today, it's just going to shatter to millions of pieces. Rocks don't fold; they're too brittle. And so if they're still soft, and Andrew Snelling just did some really good research on some folds in Grand Canyon, which he published in Answers Research Journal, which I reviewed. They're really, really long papers, but they're really thorough, and he shows that you can't bend rock. Even the rocks that are bent today, he sees no evidence when he looks at the microscopic minerals and the cements that hold the rock together. There's no evidence that these things broke, that they must have moved, and then they were cemented up later. The cements all came in later. So to fold all these rocks, and the rocks we see along the mountains that are folded up vertically or even beyond, those had to have folded while they were still non-lithified or not really solid rock yet. They were still just packed down wet sediment. And that's the reason why they can fold. As we see folds all over the world, the Alps, for example, just really tight folds.
I've heard the evolutionists saying that it was heat and pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, many of these happened at the shallow surface. I studied one of these rock slides in Wyoming. It was near the surface, and it was folded rocks that were as old as the Jurassic, and really tight folds. And there was no deep, burial to give them the heat that they need to make them kind of plastic-like. So if you go down really deep in the earth, tens of thousands of meters down, you can fold rocks. You can make cool folds. They behave plastic. But if they're near the surface, which a lot of these thrust faults are, these overthrusts, like in the Alps, they're not deep enough with not enough heat to form plastically. And so it's difficult to explain. And so some of my papers that I published before I was kind of admitted that I'm a creationist, people still disputed that, they couldn't have moved fast, but they don't explain why, because you have these tight folds and they happen at the surface. So you can fold rock if it's really deep and hot. You can fold rock if you do it really, really, really slow, supposedly, over, millions of years. But neither one of these features, it doesn't always hold true. A lot of these things happen very quickly, like you can't move thrust sheets without keeping that height, pressure. It's only going to be a short amount of time. And there's a lot of evidence to show that these rocks, when you look at the microscopic features like Andrew Snelling did, you don't see evidence of fracturing. They look like they flowed because they did. They were still wet. And then they were cemented up later. And so that's a good argument. Anytime you see these tight folds and rocks that are folding around like we see in the Alps and we see in mountain ranges all over the world, any sort of fold, that's evidence that those rocks were folded when they were still wet. They were just packed down. There's some faults, sure, but rocks eventually run out of room, even if it's wet sediment, and so you're going to get it to crack. But a lot of it, the tight folding, to me, is kind of a creation moment, because it shows that only the conditions right after the flood could cause that, and that's when the mountains were popping up, as we talked about earlier. As the floodwaters were receding, most of that double thicknesses were causing the mountains to go way up, and they were folding these rocks. So the reason we find dinosaurs in the U.S. is because those rocks were folded up so quickly and eroded by the receding phase down to where the dinosaurs are exposed. There's lots of dinosaurs underground all over the world, but we'll never find them because they're still buried under thousands of meters of sediment.
We talk a lot about flood rocks. What about creation rocks?
There's some of those too, we think. Even those, I think, were altered and squeezed and cooked. So if you go down to the so-called basement of the earth, the crust of the earth, like the bottom of Grand Canyon, and then up in Canada, places that are called shield areas, Brazil, the sub-Saharan Africa, India, those areas, Ukraine, Scandinavia, those areas you can see the crystalline rock, the crust of the earth exposed. But when you look at that crystalline rock, you see it's been highly squeezed and deformed. Lots of intrusions of magma coming in. So the original created rock, I believe, like in Grand Canyon, is the metamorphic rock down there that's been cooked. There's a lot of intrusions that came in, I think, during the flood year.
So no more Garden of Eden, no more Tree of Life.
Right. No, the Garden of Eden, I don't know where it was. It's been wiped off the earth right down to the crust. And so most areas where humans were living, I believe, the highest elevations were stripped right down to the crust. And so that's Canada, Brazil, Scandinavia, those areas. You put them all back together, you get some big land areas that were high elevation, probably where the mammals were living, most of them, and most of the trees, the flowering plants, all these things that's supposed to show up late in the rocks because they were buried late. They were buried later in the flood year, but they were stripped right down to the crust. And so there's any evidence of human civilization has been wiped off the earth. There's no evidence that I've ever found of any structures that survived the flood from pre-flood humans. Everything's post-flood. The pyramids are post-flood, the Stonehenge is post-flood. All these things are all post-flood. Humans are very, very smart. And so they started working and making calendars and stuff so they could tell the time. And I think they were sailing around the world even before, they were getting copper, say, from Michigan and bringing it back to Cyprus. And pure copper, they found a boat that sank near offshore Cyprus even before the Phoenicians. That is 90% pure copper, 10% tin, which is the recipe for making bronze. But they were extracting this stuff right after the flood. I think they were sailing all over, and then we just kind of forgot. And then the Phoenicians started sailing, and then we forgot because they didn't have a written language because God divided the languages. People didn't have a good written language, and so they made a lot of things, did a lot of moving around. And the only place you find a lot of pure copper in the world is in Michigan. There's these big pits that they have in some of these areas that were dug, and they carbon-14 dated them, which I think is somewhat accurate for a few thousand years before it goes off the charts. They dated them as about, right after what would have been the flood. And so I think there really were humans searching the world looking for minerals, and that's why the Bronze Age took a little while until they found enough tin and they found enough copper to start making, instead of stone tools, they could make bronze tools, and they eventually humans being smart. Neanderthal man was smart, very, very smart. They were distilling stuff underground to make resins, to make really good glues. About a year ago, I wrote an article about that they discovered. I think it was some German scientists were working on how did they make these resins, and they figured they must have cooked them underground in a distillation process. And everybody tries to think Neanderthal man, they were just, they weren't too smart, but they were smarter than us probably. we're okay. Mutating. We're mutating every generation. Bad mutations building up in our
degenerating. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, what about oil and coal formation? How does it form? Do we need millions of years for this one?
No, we can form in the laboratory. They've made oil in less than an hour under the right conditions, and they've made coal, and I figured they can make coal in just a matter of hours or weeks under the right conditions. Again, it's all about the right conditions, and the flood gave us those right conditions to make things fast. But when I worked for Chevron, they told me the oil in Wyoming was 150 million years old. And it migrated across, and it's just sitting there underground waiting. So when I went back and studied groundwater geology, I realized there's groundwater flowing all the time. Everywhere in the world, there's always groundwater. You're always bringing in new bacteria. And the best explanation the geologists have is they try to say the oil was pasteurized at 80 degrees Celsius. But it's not going to stay pasteurized. Even if it was, you're going to get new bacteria coming in. The oil got there because of groundwater flow. And it got trapped in these anticlines, like an upside down bowl, so to speak. It can't sit there for millions of years. Just like you can't put gasoline in a shed for 20 years and then try to use it in a generator or a lawnmower or something. It's going to start breaking down. Underground, there's bacteria. It's just not as fast, but there's still bacteria. As far as we've drilled, there's bacteria. And the bacteria eats the oil. So most of the oil we produce today is partly biodegraded already. The tar sands in Canada, for example, are really biodegraded. And they've eaten all the lighter elements, lighter components of the oil and just the heavy stuff. And so that in Wyoming, it's the same way. The oil is pretty heavy. It's been biodegraded, but it's not 150 million years old. It wouldn't be there. And so when we frack wells, like in West Texas, they frack, it's supposed to be 250 million years old. The rocks are that old. The oil should have all been produced millions of years ago. There should be no oil there. But yet they frack today and there's still oil. So to me, the oil is young. It can only be young. It can't last for millions of years. But
Did we
again,
date them with carbon-14?
yeah, nobody talks about it. Carbon-14 works. It's different than most of the radioactive dating methods because you're measuring how old something was when it died. And so you stop bringing in carbon-14. Right now, you and me and our grandmothers, and although mine are passed away, everybody's the same age with carbon-14 because we're all breathing in the ratio that's in the atmosphere today. We're eating foods that have carbon-14 ratio from the atmosphere, the plants, animals. We all have the same ratio. So when we die, we stop bringing that in, then the carbon-14 starts to decay in our bodies. And so they can see how small that amount is. They can kind of tell how old something is. They can tell something's 1,000 years old or 2,000 years old or 500 years old. And that works for about 3,000 years maybe. And then after that, they jump way up to 40,000 years. I don't believe those are real. Those are going back to times when the atmospheric carbon-14 was different. So you have a lot smaller amount of carbon-14. You're going to make things look 10 times older. And that's what happens to the Ice Age animals. They look 10 times older than they should be because the carbon-14 ratio is different. But it only goes back maybe 100,000 years if you believe in old Earth. You can't use it for dinosaurs, for example. But yet in dinosaurs, now are we finding original proteins and tissues and blood vessels and osteocytes. They're still original that can't last millions of years. We're also finding when they date these rocks, they date certain fossils. Even the evolutionary guys have dated some of these, and they find measurable carbon-14 in these bones, and they're seeing 40,000 years old, which again we think are 10 times older than they should be because the pre-flood world probably had a lot less carbon-14 in the atmosphere. We don't know what it was, and so we can explain that away. But if you believe in evolution, there should be no carbon-14 in these things. They should have all decayed away. And these are numbers that are showing bigger than the contamination or instrument error. There's still significant amounts of carbon. We've even found carbon-14 in diamonds that are measurable, and they're always consistent. You know, they come back instead of diamonds are supposed to be 1 billion years old or more, and they're finding carbon-14 in them. And, you know, how do you contaminate a diamond? And so it's hard to explain that away. They just ignore it, just like they ignore the evidence for rapid plate movement. They ignore John Baumgartner's work. They don't talk about the deep subducted slabs that are still cold. If it doesn't fit their model, they don't talk about it. They just ignore it. And they just go with, well, everybody believes this, so we must be right. But as I mentioned, consensus is not science. If it's consensus, you know, if you're arguing from a consensus standpoint, that's not scientific. And so there's a lot of people over the years that have, you know, like one guy in the 19th century said, you know, wash hands between surgeries, saves lives. And they fired him. Mm-hmm. He said, this guy's crazy. You know, we know what we're doing. And a lot of women were dying in childbirth because they were contaminating them from doing autopsies on dead bodies, and they go right over to give birth, you know, and they cross-contaminate. And a lot of women were having a high birth rate, you know, high death in the birth rates because of that. And so, but that was science. So it's, you know, science goes like this, but God's word is always true. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not a science book, but it's always accurate. You know, it's always, when it talks about science, it's telling you the truth.
Yeah, I think the Bible is more historical. Mm-hmm. And then we take this history and we try to do science in the present, mm-hmm. and putting them both together, we can have a coherent model. Mm-hmm. And
I agree.
Speaking of carbon-14, what about this other method to date rocks, like you know, potassium, argon, radiometric dating, uranium, lead? You know, the evolutionists, they are saying, how could all scientists be wrong? They get the billions of years everywhere. So they say, how can you adopt this method?
Yeah, well, there's problems with that method. They've kind of came up, as I mentioned, the idea of millions of years and billions of years was already around before they could date things with these methods. And you know, those dating methods didn't come around until the kind of early to mid 20th century. And so you can use things like rubidium and strontium and things that have really, really slow decay rates. And in principle, it would work, but you don't know what the starting point was, and all you have is the end point. You don't know how much of the original material, the parent material was there, how much daughter was there. has anything been moved in and out of the system? And so it's like trying to solve, if you're a mathematician, you have 4 unknowns and you have 2 equations. You can't solve that. You need 4 equations with 4 unknowns. So they assume 2 of the equation answers, and then they solve the other 2, and they go, oh, look, we get, billions of years. Oh, look, we get 100 million years, or whatever the case is. But they assume things to get kind of in the ballpark of where they are. And there's even a lot of published numbers where they show rocks, like in Grand Canyon at the bottom, 300 million year old crystals in rocks that are supposed to be 500 million years old. So even they themselves will find discrepancies, and they say, well, there must be some sort of contamination going on here. So they find a lot of numbers. It's not as consistent as the storyline goes. Numbers all around. And so but again, they're always assuming there's no groundwater flow. And the more I studied groundwater, the more you've got groundwater constantly flowing through the system. If these rocks are really millions or billions of years old, you've got millions and billions of years of groundwater flow coming through, bringing in different chemistry and washing things out, dissolving things. You cannot tell what was originally there, and all you can see is what's there today. And so you don't know where the clock begins. So they assume that, and they get the numbers approximately they want. So as long as their number fits what other people have been finding, they can publish it. But if it's way out of whack, they can't publish it. And so they'll claim, well, it was a bad sample, it was contamination in our sample, whatever the case is. And so it's kind of like the emperor's new clothes story, where as long as you keep saying the emperor's got these wonderful clothes on, you can get published. If you say, well, my data show this, this, and this, but even to get those numbers, you have to assume certain things, which, because they've got the microphone, so to speak, because they have the consensus, they can say what they want. But there's really not any way to verify those dates. You can't go back in time. And that's why the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago in their worldview until about 15 years ago, and now it's 66. So they recalibrated. So if you watch the movie that came out, the United States made a movie called 65 about a year ago. It should have been 66. But they didn't get the message from when they went to school and when they made the movie in Hollywood. They would have missed the whole thing. If they had gone back in time to 65 million years ago, they would have already missed it. And so it's just kind of funny how they change the numbers around. What's a million years? And so, but to them, they believe it's real. But you can't even imagine a million years, let alone just throwing these numbers out there. So there's a lot of methods where they justify their great ages, but all the methods are based on a series of assumptions that can't be verified. You can't go back. The only way they try to verify is to say, well, I did rubidium, strontium, I did germanium, lead, and the numbers are kind of close. But a lot of times those numbers will be way off. We did that with our ICR, worked on a rate project 18, 20 years ago. And they showed you take rocks from certain mountain ranges and they send them into different labs, different methods, and they got numbers, sometimes 500 million years off the same rocks, depending on what method you use. So even the different methods don't give you consistent numbers. And so something's not right. And so the best solution is to say that, we don't know how old these rocks are. The Bible tells us, based on the genealogies, the earth is about 6,000 years old. There's nothing out there in the scientific world that tells me anything otherwise that's really verifiable and that you can say, yes, it's really that old. Carbon-14, you can find coins from certain Roman emperors. You can verify your carbon-14 dates to about 3,000 years ago. But after that, all of a sudden they jump way up too. And so without a way to verify these numbers, they're precise based on the assumptions they make, but they're not accurate. And so I don't believe any of these great dates are really real.
Okay. Can you say now a word about a topic that I don't hear a lot, but I discovered in your book, that I have with me?
You have that big book? Oh, man.
Yeah.
Anthony,
do you know who wrote it?
Yeah, I know that guy.
Okay.
That shows 3 continents with the data. Since that I've done Europe and Asia and Australia, and it's the same pattern, by the way.
I'm still really writing for Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did Europe. I did an article on Europe, but I've got a new book that's going to come out probably late next year. That's going to show a shorter book. It's only about 30,000 words. That one's about 100 and some thousand. It'll be a shorter book. It just shows the 6 continents worth of data, and
So
includes Europe.
I wanted to speak about this, the stromatolites.
Oh yeah.
You spoke about that, like it kind of back up the pre-flood world, the hydrology of the pre-flood world. So it's very interesting, this topic. Can you say a word about this?
A little bit. I mean, stromatolites, when I look at the rocks, especially there's a lot of, on every continent, there's some pre-Cambrian, or there's some sediments that are before the Cambrian. And I think some of that might be part of the flood, some of it might be the pre-flood world, but many of those rocks we see evidence of these stromatolites, these algal mounds that kind of build up. And there's still like 2 locations in the world today where you can see it. One's in Australia, and one I think is in the Caribbean somewhere. So you have to have special chemistry to the waters, but that seemed to be very common in the pre-flood world, that you find lots and lots of evidence of these stromatolites, that the world, God made was different in these shallow seas, and that's why you had trilobites and animals that are extinct today, because you had all this special environment that God made, which was destroyed in the flood. So most of the stromatolites, when they were destroyed in the flood, except for a few survive today, very, very few. But they're very common in the pre-flood world. Exactly, they have to have a little different chemistry of water than what we see in most of the world today to live and thrive. So there was something different about much of the pre-flood world than what we see today. To allow these animals, they're really a bacteria, but they make a mat, and the mat collects sediment, and so you're really looking at the sediment that built up from this, single-celled bacteria type algae, almost like of an animal.
So, was there rain before the flood?
I believe there probably was some light rain, maybe. The Bible talks about a mist went up, and but in context, it talks about before humans were tilling the earth, kind of thing. So I don't think there was a heavy rain, but exactly that's a big mystery. What was the hydrology like? How do you get the water to come out? Were there big zones of water under the earth? There was actually fountains the Bible talks about that burst, but a lot of the volcanic activity today still produces water. A lot of the gases that come out of volcanoes are CO2 and water. And so there might have been some, I'm not a big fan of huge, caverns of water down there, but I don't know. Today we don't see that. We see water trapped in the rocks. As they melt and come out, they release that water. So there's a lot of water down below they found out with seismic data below the crust, but it's trapped in the rocks. But as it comes out as magma, it releases that as water. But so I'm not sure how God worked the pre-flood world. I think there was definitely a mist, whether that was a light rain, was there water kind of coming out? I don't know. You got me on that one, Auntie. I even after all this time, I still don't understand. I don't know if we will on Earth ever understand what the pre-flood hydrology was really like. But there was some sort of a hydrologic cycle of sorts, just like we have now.
Okay. We also have a very interesting topic, which is the young faint sun paradox. And it seems to show that the Earth is young, and because the Earth would have been too cold if the universe was billions of years old. And I know it has some topic related to geology, because I've seen publications where the evolutionists they try to argue with the level of oxygen in very old rocks. Do you know some? Can you say something about this topic?
Well,
because they try to have a greenhouse effect.
Right. If you go back billions of years, of course, the sun they think would have been, different luminosity, a different amount of radiation coming off, and it creates a problem for trying to have plants. Early in Earth's history, with the stromatolites, basically some of the first evidence in the oldest rocks of life, which I think was part of the pre-flood world. But those rocks supposedly help produce the oxygen. Well, plants today produce oxygen. These stromatolites would presumably be like blue-green algae. They would produce oxygen, and so they theoretically to get life to somehow form from non-life, you need an atmosphere with no oxygen. And so it's kind of a complicated thing. That's again, there's a story they tell in all the geology classes, but very, very weak, but they don't tell you that. And so everybody kind of hears the same story that somehow life formed from non-living. But you look at most of the, clays and things that God made man out of, it's inorganic. It's made of inorganic chemistry. It's made based on silicate minerals, whereas living things are based on the carbon. They're organic compounds. They're completely different. So God must have, changed inorganic miraculously to organic compounds to make Adam and then ultimately Eve. And life in general is completely different than just the rocks and the clays and the minerals that we find. So to get non-living things to form living things is difficult, but it's even more difficult with the sun. If you go back in time, the light would have been different. And so I'm not sure where you want me to go on that exactly. I'm not as familiar. I've heard about it, but there is another problem I learned about way back in 1982 when I was in grad school, when I was in undergrad. They talked about in my textbook how the Earth and the moon are moving away from each other at a rate today that if we go back 2 billion years even, they're too close. And so they said, well, that's a big problem, but we shouldn't project things into the past. But that's all uniformitarian people do. They project what we see today into the past. They say it's dangerous to do that when it doesn't work out for them. And so in this case, the Earth is receding too quickly from the moon to be more than, they're supposed to form together 4.5 billion years ago. But they couldn't. And there's evidence in the rocks that the moon was there in the fossils all along.
Do you think the preferred world was much better than our world today?
I think so. I think it was probably a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere, and a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. So it was a global greenhouse, I think, everywhere. Although most of the continents, I think, were massed around the equator and maybe 45 degrees north and south of that. Everything kind of fit in there. I don't think you had a landmass at the South Pole. I don't believe in Rodinia. Some creationists talk about Rodinia broken to Pangea. I don't believe that. I wrote some papers on that because you can only make ocean crust once. And once you make it and you make all new hot crust, you can't make it again. That's why it stopped. And so most of the guys pushing that are paleontologists who don't quite understand geophysics very well. I had a lot of geophysics classes, and John Baumgartner and I were in pretty much agreement on that you can only move it once. So start with the Pangea that's kind of around the equator. I think it was with a thicker atmosphere, for whatever reason. That a lot of that was destroyed in the flood because you pulled a lot of that CO2 out and the oxygen out to make all these rocks we see, like limestone. Limestone is calcium carbonate, so you need a lot of CO2 to help make that. And in the process, to make the Dolomites, for example, in Italy, and those other limestones that we see all around the world, those particular rocks had to be created during the flood quickly. You had to where it all come from. You had to pull it out from the atmosphere. So I think there's a way to explain how the atmosphere changed by turning a lot of them into rocks. And I think a lot of CO2 is being released today through the rocks. There's just a study that showed about 6 months ago that the shales are releasing a lot of CO2 just as they weather, which they thought was the opposite. But recently they found, I wrote an article on our ICR website about that, how CO2 is being released from shale. Well, if they would study limestones and dolomites around the world, they find out there's a lot more CO2 being released from those that was sequestered during the flood year. And as they're exposed to the atmosphere today, they're weathering and they're releasing CO2, just like when you add acid to chalk, for example, it bubbles because you're releasing CO2. And so there's a lot of CO2 being released. I think there's a lot of CO2 that's being produced by the earth and not by humans that's causing the increase in CO2, which people blame it all on humans. But you got a steady increase in CO2 in the last 100 years, and humans are producing it like this. It shouldn't be so steady, but if the earth is releasing it through these rocks, which I suspect is a bigger factor than we like to pretend that, the scientific world today and politicians like to blame it all on us, just like they blame the 40 years ago, they blamed, maybe even more now, they blamed, I'm getting old, I can't remember, back in the day, there was, all about the ozone hole in the Antarctica. We got to stop using, fluorocarbons and CFCs, they call them, because it's destroying the ozone hole, but it really didn't do anything. We spent billions of dollars getting rid of all these things and get rid of Freon, all these gases. And the ozone's up in the stratosphere. And we're doing stuff in the troposphere. It's not really getting up there. to destroy it. And there's still an ozone hole over Antarctica. Nothing's changed. It's the same. That's the way it was. I mean, we didn't notice it until we detected it. And there's nobody living in Antarctica. There's penguins, and so that the radiation that gets through there it's more caused by the magnetic field of the Earth. That's why there's very little ozone there. It isn't because of what humans did. But yet they blamed it all on humans, and they spent billions of dollars trying to fix the problem that was never a problem to begin with. And I think that's part of the climate change thing is the same thing. We're trying to run around and fix things. And people,
God promised that the climate would be stable.
That's correct. Until until
the end.
Yeah. He says in Genesis that he's going to keep it till he returns. He's going to keep it. He's got checks and balances. And I think a lot of it's, the evolutionary world has convinced us there's no God. We got to fix it all ourselves. We got to be the God. And so people like Greta Thunberg, she sincerely believes that we got to do something because she was taught that. And so I don't blame her. I just think that these poor young kids coming up are hearing all this scare, we got to do this, we're all going to die, and these are going to die. And every prediction they've made has never come true. We should have all the ice should have been melted by now. All the, polar bears should have been dead by now. And none of this is coming true because God's got it under control. And he's got checks and balances. And sure, maybe CO2 is going up, but that's not a bad thing. Plants love CO2. There's more plants in the world today now than there's been in the last 50 years. And that's producing oxygen for us. So CO2 and oxygen levels, it's all good. It's going back to where the world was in some regards, but here we are fighting it every step of the way and blaming it on burning fossil fuels, which fossil fuels has made our world better. Fossil fuels were provided by the flood.
We think the climate was designed, and it can be balanced.
Yeah, God knew we need these energy resources now. So during the judgment of the flood, which was the judgment for the wickedness of man, he provided all this energy resources and minerals for us to use to get us to survive until he returns. What would people do without electricity? Electricity, most of it's generated by fossil fuels. Over three-fourths of our energy today is provided by oil, coal, and natural gas. I'm all for, renewable, wind and hydroelectric power and things like that. We need to supplement. You can't just rely on one thing, but you can't just get rid of oil and gas and say we're not going to use it anymore. We'll go back to the Stone Age. Your computers won't run unless you have a little solar panel. I mean, people don't realize they plug their electric cars in, and the electric cars, a lot of the electricity is coming from the coal plant. And so it's, how clean is this? And I worry about that. I taught environmental geology for years, and what we do now, I'm more worried about pollution, air pollution, water pollution. We're still injecting all of our hazardous waste into deep wells all over the world, just pushing it down 5,000 feet down. And where's it going? Nobody knows. It's just going down deeper. So we're burying our problems deeper is all we're doing. And to me, that is a bigger concern than CO2 increasing in the world.
Okay, so Dr. Clarey, to finish this conversation, if the flood really occurred, which we believe it did, what does that tell us about God and sin? Because God destroyed the entire world, a beautiful world, many forests, many animals, wonderful animals, all humankind, maybe a few millions of human people at that time.
Maybe more.
So all of them were destroyed. It's a terrible judgment. It's not a joke. When we see book about Noah's flood for kids, they draw it in a funny way. It's a cartoon. But when you try to visualize, to imagine what happened with the crust breaking up, mountains rising, valleys sinking, waters rising, we see on TV every day different floods everywhere in the world, in Asia, in America, in Europe. There are big flooding. And we see the devastation for local flood. So a global flood must have been terrible. And I can imagine people outside the ark, because they received the preach from Noah, but they didn't believe him. The ark was there. They could see the ark for decades, but they didn't go inside. They thought it was crazy. And today we somehow have the same situation. We have like a modern ark, which is Jesus Christ. We think he's the door.
Amen. He says he's the door. He's the door of salvation.
He's the door, and it's not a random word that it shows is there. So it seems like God doesn't. He doesn't joke with sin. He doesn't like it, and he will judge it. And the only solution we have today is the door, is Jesus Christ. So can you say a word about a theological word about this?
Sure. Yeah, I like to tie it back to Jesus all the time. We try to do that in our talks. But this judgment that we see, the evidence of the flood that I see all over the world in the sediments, the buried animals, even in the crust where a lot of the crust actually melted and cooked and was squeezed. You see, it's almost like the scars in Jesus' hand. It's there to show us it really happened. It's a real thing. People, where's the evidence? Well, look down. Everywhere you look, there's effects of the flood. It's just that people can't imagine it. And even in the days of Noah, they didn't have any local floods, probably. So they didn't know what a flood was. We have local floods. We kind of can imagine the catastrophes from a local flood, but imagine it on a worldwide thing. And the Bible talks about how the water kept going higher and higher in Genesis 7 until it reached a peak, we believe, on day 150, the Bible says. So you had 150 days before most of the humans were probably wiped off the earth.
You have time to regret.
It's a long time to regret that I didn't get through that door and God shut the door in the ark, and then their fates were sealed. But it was a long time before they were killed. Early on it was just rainfall, just affecting the shallow seas, I think, and then the water came higher to the coastal areas, and then went higher yet to the lowlands, and then the uplands, and then humans were scurrying around, and the animals were trying to scurry around. But they saw no way out. The water just kept coming higher and higher, and so it must have been awful, the amount of regret and wailing and calling upon God's name to save them. But by then it was too late. And that's the same thing we're going to have when people die today. They have the opportunity to accept Jesus, to believe in Jesus as their only hope of salvation, and to give them joy in their lives, knowing that you'll be with Jesus for all eternity. If you believe Jesus, if you go through what he says, I am the door of salvation. Any man that comes, to me will find pasture. Just like the door of the ark was salvation. But only 8 people went in. Noah and his immediate family. That was it. Not even his cousins and things. I mean, just nobody else went in. Nobody believed him. They think, yeah. And that's the way it's getting today. The evolutionary scientific community is so pushing God out of the picture. We don't need a God. We don't need a God. We don't need a God. But there will be another judgment when everybody dies and you face God himself. There'll be that judgment. But with those of us that are saved through the grace of Jesus, through his love, by believing in him, we will escape that final judgment of wrath. Our sins are forgiven. As long as we repent and believe in Jesus, we can escape that. But that was a real judgment. And yes, that's one of the reasons why the world tries to downplay it. They don't want to believe there was this judgment that took place. They want to make it into our little cartoon characters with giraffes sticking up through. But the ark was probably just a huge barge, that was it 100, I don't remember how big it was.
150 meters long, something like
that. Yeah, we would say like we're 450 to 500 feet long here in the U.S. But we're using the wrong units. As a scientist, I have to convert back and forth all the time because we're so messed up here in the U.S. We never changed to metric, which we should have done. But I did find out the British are even worse than us. They still have their miles on the roads. I'm like, I thought you guys were metric. And I'm like, no, we still have 100 miles. I said, is that 100 kilometers or miles? No, it's 100 miles. So the British guide that I was with one time said, where am I messed up than you? Anyway, nonetheless, it was a serious judgment, and it's there. The evidence is there, just like it says in Romans 1 that there's a creator. That God's, looking at your hand, for example, my boss talks about, you can look at your hand, and you just know as a child, even as a child, things were created. Paintings were created by somebody. They didn't just happen. And here we have this miraculous, designed body. Animals are designed wonderfully to do what they do, and yet they just deny that. Oh, that just happened by just chance, an accident. To say, how can that happen? How do you build furniture? How do you build a computer? without intelligence. You have to have the evidence is there, and the evidence for the flood is there. If people had just spend the time looking down like I did, looking at the rocks all over the world, it really is. And that's why it's a joy to write those kinds of books that you have. Now I have a book that'll cover all 6 continents, and they all show the same general pattern that you see in the first 3 continents I studied. The evidence for the flood is compelling. It's there. It's right in front of them. But yet, the scientific community denies it, and they just argue from consensus that, well, we can't all be wrong. But yes, they can, because if it goes against God's word, it's wrong. And so God's word says there was a global flood, and I see the evidence for it, but yet they still deny it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Clarey, for your time.
Yeah. Anyway, yes, but thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. That's all I know, pretty much. But
merci
beaucoup.
beaucoup.
It means thank you very much. So, and I appreciate the time that you spend, and the questions were awesome, and you're a very wonderful host, Anthony. Hopefully someday I'll meet you on this earth, or I'll meet you in heaven.
Well, yes, we will.
Okay. All right. Well, God bless you all, and your audience too. All right. Bye-bye.